Guy Lewis joins us now. He is the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. And Guy, thanks so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
This is a major development in Washington that's going to have an impact for a long time. First of all, do you agree with that? And secondly, I want to ask you about two issues that people say may change as a result of this. One is gay rights. The other one is abortion. You agree?
I do, Elliot. This is a huge shift. I mean, truly, I don't think I'm sort of waving the flag too much by saying this is going to be the Trump legacy in many respects. The opportunity to name yet a second, by all accounts, very conservative Supreme Court justice, and all of the 5-4 decisions, whether it's affirmative action, whether it is same-sex marriage, whether it is some of these others that are being talked about, I would suggest to you that all of those decisions very well could be revisited.
So Republicans and Democrats alike, all kinds of politicians have been quick to speak out about whether they approve of this or disapprove, and whether they're excited or disappointed. Do you think the Supreme Court has become too political, or has it always been this way?
Rudabeh, I think it's always been political in the sense of the president, of course, has his prerogative in terms of an appointment. But it seems like now, in this day and age, it's extreme political. Everyone expects someone like Trump or Bush or to pick a moderate to conservative. Everyone expects Obama or Clinton to pick a moderate to a liberal. What we've lost, it seems to me, is that moderate, that middle ground that I think most of us look for when we're trying to decide what's right and wrong in terms of the law and what it should look like and what it should be.
Well, we already know this list that Angelica mentioned in her report that's made up of 25 or so names that have already been vetted. These are names that have already been approved by conservative judicial organizations, and they sort of have the stamp of approval there. These would not be wishy-washy, you know, David Souter types who could be named by a Republican president only to then be a liberal when he gets to the Supreme Court. A couple of these names on the list are from Florida, right?
That's right, Rick. Boy, you look at the list, and first of all, it's an extraordinarily talented group of people. There's no question. And I'm glad that the president is looking to South Florida for potential candidates. Former Chief Judge Moreno, very, very talented. I would suggest to you that former U.S. Attorney Stan Marcus, who's on the 11th Circuit, would also be a great candidate. These are judges who really they've tried cases. They've been there. They would be terrific. They would get approved, I think, by the Senate, which may be a very important consideration when the president is back huddling with his team trying to decide, okay, who do we pick? I would suggest to you confirmation may be an important consideration.
Well, we know that in 2016, when President Obama nominated Merrick Garland, Mitch McConnell, the Speaker of the president of the majority leader in the Senate, said, well, now's not the time to have those hearings because we have an election coming up. He is saying something totally different this time.
Right.
Do you think that President Trump, there's a chance that President Trump could nominate a conservative? I mean, somebody who is independent, somebody who's more towards the middle of the road?
I think we look at his first nomination and we look at some of the other names on the list, especially those that he interviewed for the Gorsuch nomination, who didn't make the final pick, but did make the top 2 or 3. These are very, very conservative judges, one of whom, for example, called the decisions on abortion an abomination. His words, not mine. And so these are judges, I think, several of whom would look at a lot of these 5-4 decisions and say, forget it. Affirmative action, forget it. Abortion, forget it. Same-sex marriage, forget it. You may see some serious, substantial shift in terms of the law over the next 20, 30 years.
What about the timing of this? Because it will make a difference in terms of Senate confirmation hearings, whether it's before the midterms or after the midterms, presumably, right?
Boy, I tell you, Rudabeh, I think, to me, that's one of the most interesting sort of questions right now on the table is the timing of it and how this confirmation hearing, the potential confirmation hearing would look. I think it's going to be nasty. I really do. I mean, I look back and you look at Bork, By the way, when Bork didn't get it, who was the nominee?
Thomas.
Justice Kennedy.
Oh, Kennedy.
When
that's right,
Thomas
Kennedy.
went through and sought the nominee, that he barely made it by a razor-thin margin because it was so vitriolic. Both sides just angry with each other in terms of the
You
nomination.
want to relive something like that?
I think you're going to see it, Elliot. I really do.
Real quickly, Guy, before we run out of time, the idea of precedent, because this court looks back on past decisions in order to make future decisions or present-day decisions. When you talk about all those different areas where they could revisit decisions that have already been made, aren't these settled cases now? Isn't Roe v. Wade the law of the land?
You really would think, Rick, and that's a perfectly fair observation. But I would cite to you, for example, the exact same case on the union issue about whether or not you can require government employees to contribute to a union. That exact same case was decided 2 years ago. And they decided 4-4 that you could. They left the decision intact. Well, it changed yesterday by a 5-4 decision that Gorsuch put them over the top in terms of the Republicans.
Right. So, no, they cannot be forced to pay dues to join a union, which is a major blow to unions across the country.
And that's what the Supreme Court decided yesterday, and some have predicted that the Democratic coffers are going to they're going to feel the pinch accordingly.
Guy Lewis, thank you very much.
Thank you,
to see
Guy.
you.
Good deal.
Appreciate your insight.